The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as Elena Martinez pushed the medication cart down the ICU corridor at Oak Creek Memorial, her footsteps barely audible against the polished tile. 5:23 a.m. The world still belonged to machines and the people who serviced them. She moved through corridors like water, finding the lowest point, present but invisible, efficient but unremarkable, her scrubs a shade of blue that matched 1,000 other scrubs in 1,000 other hospitals. The antiseptic smell clung to her skin, layering itself over 2 decades of her life in rooms like this, and she'd stopped noticing it the same way soldiers stop noticing the weight of their gear. It becomes part of you. It becomes the only air you remember how to breathe. Her hands moved through the morning medication protocol with surgical precision, drawing up insulin, checking labels twice, her fingers steady on the syringe barrels even though something deeper in her muscles remembered different hands, younger hands, trembling in a different kind of darkness. She caught her reflection in the glass cabinet door of the med station and saw exactly what she'd spent 2 decades constructing, a middle-aged ICU nurse with graying temples and no distinguishing features, the kind of person people forgot within seconds of meeting them. That was the entire point. That was survival. In her locker at home, wrapped in plastic and buried beneath her street clothes, sat a shoebox containing a pair of combat boots. Desert tan. Still caked with a fine pale dust that had blown in from Helmand Province 18 years ago, dust that she'd never quite managed to wash away completely. Once a month she opened that shoebox, held the boots in both hands, pressed the worn leather against her chest until her heart rate normalized, then locked them away again before her son could see. Her hands would tremor slightly for hours afterward, a betrayal of her nervous system that she learned to manage by staying busy, always keeping her hands occupied with legitimate work. A patient's for needed checking. The next medication drawer needed organizing. The tremor was something that happened to other people, weaker people, people who'd made different choices about what they'd carry forward. Elena closed the med cabinet with a soft click and turned toward patient room for 12, where a post-op cardiac patient needed his morning antibiotics and a full assessment. That was when she noticed Dr. Sterling standing near the nursing station with his arms crossed, his white coat pristine and pressed like it had been starched by people who understood hierarchy. He was watching her with the casual dismissal of a man examining furniture he'd never actually sit on, noting her efficiency, her movement through the space, her competence, and finding it all perfectly competent and perfectly unremarkable. She was a tool. Tools didn't require respect. Tools required maintenance. Sterling had built his 15-year reputation at Oak Creek Memorial on something that had nothing to do with actual surgical skill and everything to do with his ability to work a board meeting like it was a surgical suite. His father had endowed the pediatric wing. His fraternity brother sat on the hospital's executive committee. His ex-wife's father was the mayor's chief of staff. Those relationships were his true scalpels, the instruments with which he carved out authority and influence, the way he maneuvered himself into the chief of surgery position despite the fact that residents and junior attending physicians had begun tracking his complication rates with the grim humor of people keeping a tally. 37 days since his last serious adverse event. 42. 19. The numbers reset and accumulated like a dark countdown that nobody above his pay grade seemed willing to examine. Elena didn't meet his gaze as she passed him, and this was entirely intentional. Meeting someone's gaze required an acknowledgement of mutual humanity, and Sterling conducted his interactions like a man speaking to people he'd already decided were lesser. She'd learned this calculus in her first 3 months at Oak Creek Memorial, the way some doctors treated nurses like sentient equipment, how they spoke in your presence without actually speaking to you, how they could perform a dismissal with nothing but a glance. There were other doctors, good ones, the kind who knew that the nurse managing 5 unstable patients at 3 a.m. was carrying more clinical complexity than they'd see in a month of office hours, but Sterling wasn't built that way. Sterling was built like a fortress around something he was protecting, the idea that knowledge and institutional position were the same as competence. She returned to the nursing station 40 minutes later after completing her morning rounds, the patient reports filed and the assessments documented with the kind of careful attention to detail that would have been impossible if you were actually just a bedpan nurse. But that was the thing about being invisible, nobody checked your work closely enough to notice that it was operating at a different level entirely. A routine patient assessment, in Elena's hands, involved an instinctive recognition of subtle changes in respiratory pattern that preceded decompensation by 4 to 8 hours. She noticed the relationship between blood pressure trends and subtle shifts in mental status before the monitor did. During codes, when the attending physician was shouting orders and the junior residents were frozen with the particular paralysis of people trained to follow but not to think, her hands would move on muscle memory through procedures she hadn't performed in 18 years but her body remembered perfectly. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle going in at the correct angle, the hiss of air escaping from a tension pneumothorax, the patient's oxygen saturation climbing from the 60s into the 80s within seconds. Then everyone would move again, the crisis would pass, and by the time the attending thanked everyone for their efforts, Elena would be back at the med station, her hands perfectly steady, her expression perfectly neutral. That evening, she picked up her son Marcus from his mother's house. Her ex-wife had retained primary custody in the divorce 5 years ago, which Elena had not contested because she had nothing to fight with and everything to hide. He was 14 now, tall enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, his face beginning to settle into the architecture of the man he'd become. He carried his backpack from the car to their apartment with the careful weight of adolescent confusion, and once inside, once the door was closed and the world was reduced to the two of them and the hum of the refrigerator, he asked the question he'd been holding back for weeks. "Why don't you ever talk about before?" Marcus sat on the kitchen counter, his long legs swinging slightly, his tone carefully neutral in the way of teenagers who'd learned that directness was sometimes the only way to get adults to actually answer. Like, "Mom, your mom. My grandma, she has all these stories about when you were younger, but you never say anything about like, where you were for those years. When you disappeared." Elena didn't look up from the dinner she was preparing, her knife moving through an onion with the same measured rhythm it always did. The blade was sharp. She kept all her knives sharp. A dull knife was more likely to slip, and slips created injuries, and injuries created explanations. "I was in school," she said, which was technically true if you counted certain kinds of training. "I was figuring out who I was." That's not an answer. Marcus shifted his weight on the counter, and she heard the judgment in his voice without looking, the particular frustration of a child beginning to understand that their parents were withholding something significant. "I'm old enough. You could just tell me." She could. Elena Martinez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Command, 3-time Bronze Star recipient, 1 Purple Heart, clearance level TS-SCI, 18 years of service including 2 tours of Helmand Province where she'd seen things that had reorganized the fundamental architecture of her understanding of human suffering and human capability. She could turn around and tell her 14-year-old son exactly what she'd been doing during those years. She could tell him about the training facility at Naval Air Station Coronado, about Hell Week, about the 79 other candidates who'd quit and the singular focus required to not be one of them. She could tell him about operations that were still classified, about mistakes she'd made that cost better people their lives, about the morning she'd pulled an 8-year-old boy from a collapsed building in Sanjin and held him while he stopped screaming. She could tell him all of that. Instead, she set the knife down on the cutting board and turned to face him with the careful composure of someone who'd spent years managing information as a survival mechanism. "I'm not ready to talk about it yet," she said, and her voice was exactly what she needed it to be, gentle enough to be honest, firm enough to be final. "But I promise you, it wasn't anything that reflected badly on you or your mother. It was just something I needed to do, and I needed to do it away from everyone I loved, so that they couldn't be hurt by it." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his teenage face caught between the urge to push further and the instinctive recognition that he'd reached a boundary his mother had established with absolute authority. He was old enough to know that some questions didn't deserve answers because the people being asked weren't ready to give them yet. Maybe that was something he'd learned from having a mother who was fundamentally unremarkable on the surface but carried something else entirely underneath. "Okay," he said finally. "But someday you're going to tell me." "Someday I might," Elena said, and she returned to the onion, her hand steady, her rhythm undisturbed. The next morning at Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Sterling held court in the surgical conference room with 3 members of the hospital's executive committee. The walls were paneled in dark wood that suggested competence and history, the kind of room where decisions about other people's careers got made while those people had no idea it was happening. Sterling was discussing the importance of maintaining institutional standards, of ensuring that hospital protocols were respected by all staff members regardless of their level, and specifically that senior nursing staff needed to understand the hierarchical distinction between nursing and medicine. One of the board members, Patricia Klein, who'd known Sterling's father in college, nodded along sympathetically while mentally calculating whether Sterling was the kind of investment that paid long-term dividends or the kind of asset that could become a liability. Some of these nurses think they understand medicine, Sterling was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone explaining something obvious to people who really should already know it. It creates problems. It creates confusion about chain of command. You have to establish clear authority, or the entire system begins to falter. None of them could have predicted, sitting in that paneled room discussing the proper maintenance of institutional hierarchy, that within 72 hours a Green Beret colonel would be admitted to Oak Creek Memorial with catastrophic injuries from an IED strike. None of them could have predicted that Elena Martinez would recognize him in his unconsciousness, that Dr. Sterling would perceive that recognition as a threat to his authority, or that the collision between those two facts would eventually bring 10 doctors to refuse a patient, would bring the Pentagon down on Oak Creek Memorial like a weight, and would expose Sterling as something worse than an incompetent surgeon, as a man willing to let someone die to protect his reputation. But that was still 72 hours away. For now, Elena moved through the ICU corridors at Oak Creek Memorial in Portland, invisible and precise, her hand steady, her past locked in a shoebox at home, her future utterly uncertain. The code blue came at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Trauma Bay 2. 60-year-old male, post-op day 2 from an emergency AAA repair, and his blood pressure had just bottomed out at 68/42. The monitor screamed. Elena was there in 4 seconds, hands already moving, pushing the crash cart, her eyes on the patient's abdomen where the surgical dressing sat dark and ominous. Dr. Sterling arrived third, which meant he was technically running the code. He barked orders like a man conducting an orchestra he'd never actually rehearsed with. Push epi. 1 milligram 4. The epinephrine went in. Compressions continued. 2 minutes. 3. The monitor showed nothing but chaotic rhythm, VFib dancing across the screen like something wild and desperate. Still in VFib, the resident called out. No change. Sterling didn't hesitate. Push another one. 1 milligram epi. The second dose went in. Elena watched the monitor. She watched the patient's distended belly. She watched Sterling's face, which had the particular glaze of a man performing medicine rather than practicing it. 5 minutes. 6. The compressions had been relentless. She could hear the ribs flexing beneath the palms of the trauma surgeon working the code. Sweat dripped from foreheads. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Still no perfusion, someone said. Sterling reached for the epi again. His hand was already extended toward the medication nurse. Push another round. 1 milligram 4 push. It was his voice that stopped Elena. Not the order itself, the certainty in it. The complete absence of doubt. The absence of anything resembling thought. She stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not with anger. Just one step that placed her at the edge of Sterling's peripheral vision. Doctor. Her voice was quiet. It cut through the monitor beeping and the compressions and the hiss of the ventilator like a blade through silk. Sterling's hand froze. He turned toward her, his expression already shifting toward contempt. Elena kept her eyes on the monitor. 3 rounds of epi in 6 minutes. His abdomen is distended. He's re-bleeding. Epi won't fix a surgical problem. She finally looked at Sterling, her gaze steady as concrete. He needs the OR. He needs a vascular surgeon. He doesn't need another round of medication. The room went silent. The compressions continued, but even the sound of skin on skin seemed muted. The entire trauma team, residents, nurses, the perfusionist, the surgical tech, had frozen. 20 years at Oak Creek Memorial had taught Elena exactly how this would land. Questioning a surgeon in a code blue. Questioning Sterling specifically. Suggesting he was wrong. Sterling turned to face her fully now, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who'd just been handed exactly what he'd been waiting for, an excuse. "Nurse Martinez," he said, loud enough for the entire bay to hear. "When did you earn your medical degree?" "Oh wait, you're just the help." Elena didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. She turned back to the monitor. "Push the epi," Sterling commanded. The medication nurse hesitated for exactly 1 second, then complied. The third dose went in. 70 seconds later, the monitor showed sinus rhythm. The patient's pressure climbed to 82. Barely alive. And 30 minutes after that, the attending vascular surgeon opened him back up and found the AAA repair had failed catastrophically, a leak so severe he should have been dead already. The patient made it to the ICU on 3 vasopressors and fresh blood products. He'd be there for weeks. He'd lose his right leg below the knee. But he'd lived. Because the repair had caught it early enough. Elena didn't watch the OR. She'd already turned away, already stripped off her gloves, already walked out of the bay before anyone could see her face. She made it to the locker room before the shaking started, but not from fear. From something colder. From the particular rage that comes from being invisible while the incompetent wear white coats and hold people's lives like casino chips. She stood in front of her locker, hands braced against the cool metal, taking measured breaths. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, maddening song. In 48 hours, Sterling would escalate. She already knew this. Already understood the calculus of institutional power and the cost of being right when you're not supposed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 days later, the hospital cafeteria was crowded with the lunch crowd. Elena sat alone at a corner table with a cup of soup, a turkey sandwich, and a bottle of water, the same lunch she brought twice a week, the same table, the same quiet corner where nobody bothered her. She was looking at her hands while she ate. Steady hands. Hands that had held pressure on bleeding vessels in sandstorms. Hands that had calculated drip rates and drawn up medications and performed wound care on soldiers whose names she no longer remembered but whose faces she'd never forget. Dr. Sterling approached from behind. She didn't see him until his voice registered, loud, carrying across the entire cafeteria with the kind of projection that came from a man who wanted an audience. "Bedpan Betty," he announced. Several heads turned. "Still down here with the civilians, I see." Elena didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge him. Just continued eating her soup. Sterling's hand came down. Not gently. His palm connected with the edge of her tray. The soup bowl went first, it didn't fall so much as exploded, spreading across the tile in a brown arc that smelled like chicken broth and failure. The sandwich followed. The water bottle tumbled. She watched it roll across the floor like it was happening to someone else. The cafeteria had gone quiet. Maybe 30 people. All watching. Sterling smirked. That was the detail Elena would remember later, the smirk. The pleasure in his face. The uncomplicated joy of a man with nothing to lose and a rank that protected him. "Clumsy hands, Martinez," he said. "Maybe you should stick to bedpans. At least you can't hurt anyone there." He walked away before she could respond. He didn't run. Didn't storm. Just walked, his white coat swaying, his stethoscope swinging, his message absolutely clear: she was nothing. She was help. She was the kind of person other people knocked things over in front of, and the world would continue spinning. Elena knelt. Not quickly. Not in anger. She simply set down her napkin, rose from her chair, and knelt on the tile floor to clean up. Someone was already offering her paper towels. She took them without meeting their eyes. The smell of spilled soup rose up, warm and salty and utterly humiliating. She was cleaning the last of it when the tear escaped. Just one. She didn't cry. Didn't shake. Didn't even make a sound. But one tear tracked down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, calmly, with the same hand that was holding the soggy napkins. That was when she looked up. Dr. Sterling was still standing 20 feet away. He'd turned back. He was watching her. His expression had the particular hunger of a man who'd just broken something and wanted to see how long it took to stop moving. Elena rose. Her knees didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet that only Sterling could hear it, and yet somehow, impossibly, the entire cafeteria seemed to lean in to catch it anyway. At least I know the difference between a scalpel and my ego, Doctor. The silence that followed had weight. It had texture. It filled the cafeteria like water rising. Sterling's face shifted, the smirk dying, something else taking its place. Something that looked like rage. Like a man who'd expected compliance and received something entirely different. He turned and left. This time he didn't come back. Elena finished cleaning. She walked to the trash with the soaked napkins, disposed of them, and returned to her corner table. She didn't eat. Didn't need to. The adrenaline would carry her through the rest of shift. She'd learned long ago that the body doesn't forget how to survive. It just transforms survival into something that looks like composure. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. Sterling left the cafeteria that day and made 4 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Patricia Hayes, the chief medical officer, a woman who'd built her position on the foundation of not rocking institutional boats. The second was to Richard Bancroft, the hospital's chief administrator, who measured success in budget margins and liability prevention. The third was to a board member named Jennifer Mitchell, who happened to owe Sterling a professional favor from a golf tournament 5 years ago. The fourth was to the nursing agency that had placed Elena 15 years earlier, the one that had never received a single complaint because Elena had spent 2 decades being invisible. In each conversation, Sterling was careful. Professional. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't make accusations. He simply asked questions. Wondered aloud. Expressed concerns. I noticed our trauma nurse seemed unusually focused on our Green Beret patient, he told Dr. Hayes. Multiple chart reviews. Standing by the bedside during shift changes. It seems familiar. I'm just concerned about the appropriate boundaries. Her background check is fairly sparse, he mentioned to Bancroft. No military history listed, but her familiarity with combat medicine seemed quite advanced for someone with just nursing credentials. I'm wondering if there might have been discrepancies in her employment application. She's been here nearly 2 decades with no significant advancement, he suggested to Mitchell. No published work. No committees. Just bedside care. I sometimes wonder about her actual qualifications. Has anyone thoroughly reviewed her credentials? By Wednesday morning, Elena's personnel file had been flagged. By Thursday, there was an official notation about her unusual interest in the colonel's case. By Friday, a formal investigation had been opened into whether she'd falsified her employment application. The investigator was meticulous. He pulled every chart she'd touched in the last year. He compared her medical documentation to the exact same cases handled by other nurses. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. She'd never falsified anything. She'd simply omitted her past. And in the eyes of hospital administration, omission was beginning to feel a lot like deception. Sterling watched it unfold with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood institutional pressure. He'd made the calls. He'd asked the questions. He'd planted the seeds. Now he could let the system do what systems do best, consume anyone who stood out too much, asked the wrong questions, challenged the hierarchy. Elena worked her next 3 shifts perfectly. Precisely. She took care of her patients with the same invisible competence she'd maintained for 20 years. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't make eye contact with Sterling when their paths crossed. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial like a ghost moving through a house, present but untethered, waiting for whatever came next. On her drive home Friday evening, her phone buzzed with an email from hospital administration. They were requesting a meeting. Monday morning. 8 a.m. Conference room C regarding her employment history. She pulled into her driveway, a modest 3-bedroom in southeast Portland where she'd raised her son as a single mother, where she'd told him almost nothing about who she'd been or where she'd come from. She sat in the car for 5 minutes without moving. The rain was starting. Portland rain, the kind that falls without drama, without fanfare, the kind that just persists. Her son would be home in an hour from his freshman year at Roosevelt High School. He'd ask about her day. She'd tell him it was fine. She'd tell him she was fine. She'd smile. She'd make dinner. She'd help him with his algebra homework. And she wouldn't tell him that everything she'd built, this quiet life, this invisible refuge, this careful distance from the woman she used to be, was beginning to collapse. Behind her, the rain continued falling. In front of her, the house waited. And in a moment she didn't yet understand, the past was moving closer, like a ship emerging from fog, like something inevitable finally arriving at shore. The call came at 11:03 p.m. Incoming trauma. Training accident turned catastrophic. A Green Beret colonel with injuries that belonged in a war zone, not a civilian hospital in Portland. Elena was restocking the ICU supply cart when the intercom crackled. Trauma Bay 1. All hands. She moved toward the elevator without hesitation, her hands already running through the mental checklist: airway, breathing, circulation, hemorrhage control. 20 years of muscle memory didn't ask permission. It just moved. The helicopter had landed 7 minutes earlier. The rotor wash had shaken the windows on the 3rd floor like distant artillery. She'd felt it in her chest, that particular vibration that meant something serious was coming. The kind of serious that made civilians freeze and trained personnel focus. Trauma Bay 1 was controlled chaos. The flight paramedics were still giving handoff report. Male, 52 years old, IED detonation during a joint training exercise in the exercise compound northeast of the city. Both legs crushed below the knee. Abdominal trauma with visible hemorrhage. Possible tension pneumothorax developing. Critical. The patient was unconscious, his face slack, machines already screaming around him. Elena approached from the side, never directly in front of the attending physician. Protocol. Humility. The mask she wore every single shift. A trauma nurse. Competent but unremarkable. The kind of person who blended into the background of other people's heroics. And then she saw his face. The scar tissue on his left cheekbone. The shape of his jaw. The particular angle of his nose that had healed slightly wrong. She had pulled that face from rubble in Helmand Province in 2004. He had been 8 years old then. Half buried in concrete dust from a collapsed compound. Crying in Pashto while she dug him out with her bare hands. Blood on both their faces. His mother long dead from the same strike. The boy had been alone except for the American soldier, Elena, then operating under the call sign Arkan, then carrying a rifle instead of a stethoscope, who'd loaded him into a Humvee and radioed for emergency evacuation to Bagram. She'd never learned what happened to him after. 18 years of not knowing. He was here. In Portland. In her hospital. A colonel now. A decorated officer. A naturalized citizen wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Unconscious and bleeding, and his lung was already showing the asymmetrical rise and fall that meant he was about 3 minutes away from cardiac arrest. Elena pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle from her pocket, the habit of 2 decades. Never farther than arm's reach. She was moving to the bedside when the doors opened. Dr. Sterling entered like a man walking into a room he already owned. The surgical team followed. 10 of them. Exactly 10. The on-call surgical crew. Trauma specialists. ICU attendings. They positioned themselves around the patient with the coordinated precision of a drill they'd practiced 100 times. Sterling glanced at the monitors. Pulse 142. Respiratory rate 38. Oxygen saturation dropping. 96. 94. 92. He looked at the patient's chest. Looked at Elena. His eyes narrowed like he was solving a puzzle he didn't like the answer to. Martinez, he said. Not a question. A statement. An accusation contained in a single name. Step back from the patient. She didn't move. The oxygen saturation ticked lower. 90. 88. The asymmetrical breathing was worse now. His left side wasn't rising enough. The air was being trapped. Pressure building. The lung collapsing slowly but inexorably toward a pressure differential that would crush his heart. His lung is collapsing, Elena said. Her voice was steady. A statement of fact. No emotion. No tremor. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Then a chest tube. Sterling turned to face her fully. Around them, the 10 doctors had gone very still. They sensed something was wrong with this interaction. They didn't understand what yet. How do you know this patient? Sterling asked. I don't. You're lying. He said it with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything that mattered to him. I've reviewed the intake logs. You were assigned to his initial assessment the moment he arrived. You requested that assignment. You knew he was coming. Elena's jaw tightened. Not fear. Not anger. Just the physical sensation of a trap closing. The thing she'd been running from for 18 years, the collision of past and present, identity and anonymity, the boy she'd pulled from rubble and the woman she'd become by never speaking about it. He needs intervention, she said. Now. His O2 is 85. Sterling raised his hand. A gesture like he was stopping traffic. This room is now a contaminated scene pending investigation conclusion. The patient may have been tampered with. Patient history may be unreliable. His lung is collapsed. And his care is now under review. Sterling turned to the surgical team. His voice dropped. The voice of institutional authority. The voice of a man who could make or break careers with a phone call. No one enters this room without written clearance from hospital administration and the licensing board. If any of you proceed without that authorization, you become complicit in whatever credential fraud is being concealed here. I will personally ensure you face licensing review. One of the surgeons shifted her weight. A hesitation. A moment where someone might have stepped forward. But Sterling's eyes tracked to her. Just for a second. Just long enough. She looked away. The other 9 doctors didn't move. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hissing and the heart monitor screaming its electronic warning. Sterling crossed his arms. His posture relaxed. He was smiling now. Just slightly. The smile of a man watching a dominoes fall exactly as he'd planned them. If you touch him, Martinez, he said, his voice low and certain, you're practicing outside your scope of licensure. That's immediate termination. And I'll personally ensure you never work in healthcare again. I have documentation going to the state board within the hour. You're finished. He turned to the surgical team. Everyone stand down. This is now a legal matter, not a medical one. The 10 doctors filed backward. Not reluctantly. Not with guilt. With the practiced obedience of people who understood that careers were fragile things. That questioning an attending physician in front of administrators meant fighting an institutional battle they couldn't win. That sometimes survival meant compliance. Dr. Sterling positioned himself at the glass partition. He could see the monitors from there. Could watch the oxygen saturation continue its descent. 85. 83. 81. He had the expression of a man watching a prediction come true. Elena looked at the patient, at the colonel, at the boy from Helmand Province, at the man she'd saved once already without him ever knowing her name, and she understood the calculus Sterling had made. He didn't care if the patient died. In fact, the patient's death would solve his problem perfectly. It would remove the evidence. It would eliminate the witness. It would be a tragedy, certainly, but a tragedy that had nothing to do with Dr. Sterling's competence and everything to do with Nurse Martinez's questionable background and the investigation that had prevented proper care. The oxygen saturation hit 79. His lips were turning blue. His extremities were beginning to show the mottled appearance of oxygen starvation. 77. The boy Elena had pulled from rubble 18 years ago was about to die in front of her while 10 doctors stood outside a glass partition and did nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The colonel's oxygen saturation dropped like a stone on the monitor. 88. 84. 79. Elena's eyes snapped to his chest, the rise and fall asymmetrical, one side barely moving, the classic geometry of a lung collapsing under pressure. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that kills fast and leaves no room for hesitation. Through the glass partition, the 10 doctors didn't move. Sterling had made his position clear, the room was contaminated pending investigation. Touching the patient meant risking their licenses. Risking their careers. Risking everything they'd spent years building. Elena moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look toward Sterling or the frozen shadows of his surgical team. She walked to the crash cart, her hands already reaching for the needle decompression kit before her conscious mind caught up. Muscle memory. Combat medicine. The kind of training that lives in your cells and doesn't ask your permission before activating. Her fingers found the 14-gauge catheter needle with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this under mortar fire while blood soaked into desert sand. The kit felt like home. She counted the ribs on the colonel's left chest wall, 1, 2, 3, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who'd forgotten more about anatomy than most doctors would ever know. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She palpated the landmarks, feeling the exact architecture of bone and cartilage beneath papery skin. Her left hand had only 9 fingers now, the others lost in Helmand Province pulling a wounded operator from a kill zone, but those 9 fingers still remembered how to read a human body like it was written in a language she'd spoken her entire life. The catheter needle slid between the ribs with a sensation like pushing through leather. Then came the sound. The hiss. The beautiful, unmistakable hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung cavity, the pneumothorax decompressing under pressure. The colonel's oxygen saturation stopped falling. Stabilized. Started climbing. 79. 82. 88. 91. His color returned like someone pulling themselves back from drowning, his skin shifting from the gray-blue of severe hypoxia to the pink of actual perfusion. His chest rose symmetrically again. Both sides moving in synchronization. Elena established peripheral for access with the same economy of motion, 1 attempt, 1 vein, fluids running wide open through a 16-gauge line. She monitored his cardiac rhythm on the bedside monitor, watching the waveform stabilize from the erratic peaks of decompensation into something resembling normal sinus rhythm. The data was telling her what she already knew, the colonel was stable. The colonel was going to live. Through the glass, Dr. Sterling's face had gone white. His phone was already at his ear. She heard him through the partition, security. Now. ICU Isolation Room 4. His voice sounded like wet gravel being poured into a concrete mixer. His hand trembled as he lowered the phone. Not with relief. With something closer to fury, the specific rage of a man watching his plan collapse in real time. The security guards arrived before Elena finished hanging the second liter of fluid. 2 of them, badges and radios and that particular expression of people performing a job they didn't understand. One of them looked at Elena with something like apology in his eyes. "Nurse Martinez, you terminated effective immediately." The voice came from behind them, Dr. Sterling himself, stepping into the room with his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Practicing outside your scope of practice. Insubordination. Interfering with an active investigation. You need to leave the building. Now." Elena didn't respond. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry or retreat or show anything remotely resembling the panic Sterling was watching for. She simply turned from the colonel's bedside, made sure his monitor was positioned for easy visibility, and checked the 481 final time. Clinical. Precise. The composure of someone who'd already survived the worst and found out the worst didn't break you if you didn't let it. "Let's go," she said to the guards, and her voice was steady as surgical steel. They walked her through the ICU. Past the nurse's station where her colleagues stood frozen, hands stopped mid-motion, watching. Past the supply room where she'd spent countless nights restocking and reorganizing. Through the emergency department, where the morning shift was just arriving for their 6 a.m. start, and every single face turned to watch as 2 security guards escorted a nurse out of Oak Creek Memorial in the dawn light. Dr. Sterling followed behind them, close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive that couldn't cover the scent of desperation. The front entrance opened onto the morning. Rain was falling over Portland in thin, cold sheets, the kind that soaked you completely before you noticed it had started. Camera flashes exploded from Sterling's phone the moment they hit the pavement. He was capturing it. Documentation. Evidence. He was creating a narrative where Elena Martinez was unstable, dangerous, a security risk who'd had to be physically removed by hospital personnel. What he didn't understand was that she'd already survived worse cameras. Worse documentation. Worse people trying to dismantle her. By 9:30 in the morning, Sterling had made 17 phone calls. Elena's lawyer would later count them, one to the State Board of Nursing, inquiring about credential verification. 3 to hospitals across the Portland metropolitan area, describing Elena as unstable under pressure and prone to scope violations. 2 to insurance companies. An email to the State Medical Investigator's Office, marked urgent, requesting an external examination of all patient charts Elena had touched in the past 2 years. Each call was a strategic move. Each one designed to contaminate every well she might drink from, to burn every bridge that could carry her forward. By 11:15, Elena was sitting at her kitchen table in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Portland, still wearing her scrubs because she'd gone straight home instead of to her locker, and she couldn't stop the trembling in her hands. Not from fear. The trembling was restraint, the specific kind that comes from having survived a lifetime of worse, from knowing exactly what she was capable of, and having to hold it in check while the world decided what story to tell about her. Her son came home from school at 3:15. 14 years old, backpack slung over one shoulder, his face already shifting from the neutral expression he wore in hallways to something softer when he saw her sitting motionless at the kitchen table. He knew something was wrong. Kids always know. "Mom? Why are you home?" He dropped his backpack by the door. "Are you sick?" Elena couldn't find words. The PTSD from Helmand had become unbearable over 18 years, and she'd chosen anonymity in a quiet nursing job to heal. She'd never told anyone, not her family, not her colleagues, not the hospital intake forms that asked about previous employment. She'd just built a new identity as an invisible woman in scrubs, someone who showed up, did her job, and disappeared. A ghost. And now even that was crumbling, and she couldn't explain it to her son because explaining meant admitting why she'd spent 2 decades hiding from people who loved her. "I'm not sick," she said finally, and her voice sounded like something breaking. There was a situation at work, and," she stopped. Started again. "I got fired." He sat down across from her without asking for details, the way good kids do when they know adults are fragile. "What happened?" "It's complicated." "Is it because of that colonel? The one you were talking about?" Elena's head snapped up. She'd mentioned him exactly once, in a voice low enough that she thought he wasn't listening. That's the thing about kids, they hear everything important and nothing you want them to catch. "I saved his life," Elena said quietly. "I wasn't supposed to. The doctors refused. So I did it anyway." Her son leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that was far too old for his 14 years. "Then you did the right thing." "The right thing got me fired." "Yeah, Mom," That happens. He said it like he was the adult and she was the confused teenager. But you did it anyway. That's what matters. Elena wanted to tell him that the right thing was complicated. That integrity came with a cost she was only now beginning to calculate. That saving lives when you were supposed to walk away made you either a hero or unemployable, and sometimes those were the same thing. Instead, she just sat there, a senior chief petty officer hiding in a two-bedroom house in Portland, while her son did his homework at the same table where her military career had ended before he was born, and her civilian life was ending right in front of him. The rain outside turned into something heavier, like the sky was finally done being gentle. 2 days had passed since the security guards escorted Elena from the building, their hands firm on her elbows as if she might detonate. 2 days of sitting at the kitchen table while the rain drummed a rhythm that sounded like distant artillery. 2 days of her son watching her with eyes that had aged 3 years overnight, asking questions she couldn't answer, understanding more than she wanted him to know. The rain was heavier now, the kind that hammered the Portland asphalt like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. Elena had stopped checking her phone after the state licensing board left their voicemail, a generic message about an inquiry into her credentials, and Sterling's investigation had already begun its work like rust spreading through metal. Her hands, the ones that had held pressure on an 8-year-old's femoral artery while insurgents fired overhead, were now useless. Unemployable. That was the word the hospital administrator had used. Outside her scope. Then her son walked through the front door at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, soaking wet, carrying a shoebox she hadn't seen in 14 years. "Come with me," he said. Not a request. Not even a question. The authority in his voice, borrowed from somewhere deep in her own chest, made her stand without thinking. The drive to Oak Creek Memorial took 12 minutes. Traffic was light, the kind of Portland afternoon where the rain didn't bother anyone anymore because they'd forgotten what sun felt like. Her son didn't explain. He just gripped that shoebox like it was holding the last breath in his body, and Elena understood that something had shifted, some invisible equilibrium had tipped while she was sitting at the kitchen table drowning in her own silence. The boardroom on the 4th floor was packed. 40 people maybe, administrators in suits that cost more than her monthly car payment, board members whose names she recognized from hospital newsletters she'd never read, camera phones held by hospital staff crowding the hallway. Dr. Sterling stood at the podium in his white coat, pristine, pressed, the uniform of someone who believed authority was written in fabric and title. He was mid-sentence, something about institutional standards and maintaining the integrity of the medical hierarchy, when her son pushed through the crowd like he was moving through water. "Mom, they need to see these," he said loudly. Not shouting. Not angry. Just clear. The kind of voice that stops conversations mid-breath. The shoebox tipped forward. The contents spilled across the mahogany conference table like a confession written in metal and cloth. A bronze star. Flat and heavy against the polished wood. A purple heart. Then another. The ribbons faded but unmistakable. Then the Navy Cross. The highest. The one she'd buried under 14 years of silence and Portland rain. And beneath them, side by side like an apology for all the years she'd worn scrubs instead of dress whites, a pair of combat boots. The leather cracked and weathered. The soles caked with dust that hadn't been Oregonian soil in over a decade, Helmand Province dirt, pressed into every crevice like a stain that refused to fade. The laces were still laced. She'd left them exactly as they were the day she'd taken them off. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became a physical thing, like the air pressure had changed, like the building itself was holding its breath. The chief nursing officer stepped forward slowly, as if approaching something dangerous. She picked up a manila folder from the table, Elena didn't know when it had arrived there, and opened it with shaking hands. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, she read, her voice precise and formal and carrying the weight of 1,000 conversations suddenly recontextualized. Naval Special Warfare Command. Attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Combat tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen. Multiple commendations. Honorable discharge with full honors. 2 Purple Hearts for combat injuries. 3 bronze stars for Valor. With each word, Elena felt the room recalculating her. Every time she'd pushed a med cart down these hallways. Every time she'd been called just a nurse. Every time Sterling had called her clumsy. The doors at the back of the conference room opened. A man in dress blues entered, command presence the way some people had bone structure, unavoidable and unmistakable. Commander Tom Halsey, his name tag read. Naval Special Warfare Command. His face was weathered like the boots on the table, creased with the kind of authority that came from having watched people die and decided to fight anyway. Senior Chief Martinez isn't just a decorated nurse, he said, and his voice moved through the room like a radar sweep. She's one of 4 female combat medics to ever earn the Navy Cross. She served in every high-casualty theater for 12 years. She saved 17 lives in direct action combat operations, including one 8-year-old Afghan civilian pulled from an IED strike in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, in 2004. Elena felt her son's hand find hers. She didn't squeeze. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the same restraint that had kept her from speaking for 2 decades, the same restraint that had stopped her from defending herself when Sterling knocked her lunch tray to the floor. That 8-year-old, Halsey continued, and something in his voice cracked like metal under pressure, grew up. He became a Green Beret himself. He's the colonel you tried to let die, Sterling. And the only reason he's alive to stand up for his country is because Senior Chief Martinez saved his life when she was 23 years old, and saved it again when she was 43 years old, and everyone in this room stood by and did nothing. The Admiral entered then, Rear Admiral insignia gleaming, flanked by hospital administrators whose expressions had gone pale as bone. The cameras in the hallway erupted like a small war. Dr. Sterling, the Admiral said flatly, and Elena felt the shift in power like a door closing on the past 6 weeks. You are terminated effective immediately for negligence and obstruction of proper medical care. Your actions nearly resulted in the death of a decorated service member under care at this facility. This matter will be documented in a formal military investigation with full media transparency and will be forwarded to the State Medical Board, the FBI, and the Department of Defense Inspector General. Security moved in like they'd been standing against the walls the whole time, waiting for this exact moment. Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. His hand reached toward the podium, then stopped. The face Elena had watched for years, confident, domineering, untouchable, he crumpled. Not in rage. In disbelief. The disbelief of someone who'd just realized that his network of favors and connections and institutional leverage had been built on sand. They escorted him through the crowd. Cameras flashed in bursts of white light. Someone was crying, maybe one of the nurses. Maybe it was the sound of 6 weeks of her own silence finally breaking open. Elena picked up the combat boots. Her hands knew their weight. 14 years, and her hands still knew exactly what they weighed. 6 months later, Elena stood in the Pentagon auditorium in her dress whites, and the Navy Cross was no longer buried in a showbox. It hung on her chest, 3/4 of an inch of metal and ribbon that suddenly meant something again after decades of silence. The dress uniform felt like coming home. The dress uniform felt like permission. The colonel took the podium in his own Green Beret uniform, the same one he'd been wearing when the IED blast had torn through his convoy. He was healed. Not physically, there were still visible scars, the favoring of his left leg, the careful way he held his shoulder, but healed in the way that only people who've been pulled back from the edge of nothing understand. I was 8 years old in Sanjin Valley when the world ended, he said, and the auditorium held so still you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer. A woman I'd never seen before put her body between me and the insurgents. She held pressure on my artery. She sang to me in Pashto. She kept me alive long enough for the bird to come. I don't remember her name that day. I just remember her voice. His voice steadied. 20 years later, she was working as a bedpan nurse at a hospital in Portland, Oregon, because PTSD had convinced her that she didn't deserve to be anything else. Because the system had taught her that invisible service was the safest kind. When I collapsed from a combat-related injury, she recognized me immediately. She did everything right. And 10 doctors refused to help me because they were more afraid of institutional consequences than they were committed to saving a life. He turned to face her directly. Senior Chief Martinez held pressure then. She held pressure during that code. She held pressure for 40 minutes under incoming fire when I was a child, and she held pressure for 15 minutes under a different kind of fire when I was a soldier. That's why I'm standing here. That's why I became what I became. That's why I'm alive to say that true heroism isn't what happens when the world is watching. It's what happens in the middle of the night when everyone else is afraid. The applause started in the front row and moved backward like a wave, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. Elena's son stood beside her, tears streaming down his face, his hand gripping hers so tightly she could feel his heartbeat through his palm. Her mother, who still didn't know most of the truth about those 12 years, was crying without understanding why, just knowing that her daughter was being honored for something that mattered. That evening, Oak Creek Memorial's new chief of surgery called. His name was Colonel Marcus Hayes, retired Army trauma surgeon, the kind of man who saw Elena's silence not as a liability but as evidence of something held in check. He offered her a position, Director of Emergency Medicine Training, Protocol Design, Teaching. A chance to transform what had tried to destroy her into something that could protect others. One condition, Elena said, and her voice was steady as stone. We hire veterans. We train staff to recognize PTSD in colleagues. We protect the ones who've been to the edge and came back. Done, he said. When can you start? Monday, she said. I'll be there Monday. 48 hours later, someone spotted Dr. Sterling at a strip mall in southeast Portland, sitting at a folding table with a printed banner, supplemental insurance policies, licensed agent Sterling. No white coat. No title. No hospital credentials. No network of favors still willing to take his calls. His medical license had been suspended statewide within 3 weeks of the Pentagon investigation. His lawyer had dropped him. His wife had filed for separation after reporters camped outside their house for a week. The supplemental insurance job paid $12 an hour, and he'd managed to keep it for exactly 6 weeks before the company discovered his background and terminated him for not disclosing his professional history. The cruelest part wasn't the fall. It was that nobody was watching anymore. He'd gone from untouchable to invisible, which was perhaps the only punishment that truly fit someone who'd tried to make someone else disappear. Elena walked back into Oak Creek Memorial for the first time since her firing on a Monday in March, 14 months after the code that changed everything. She wore her dress whites because they were her uniform and they meant something now that she'd decided to stop hiding. The nurses' station erupted in applause. Not the polite kind. The kind that came from people who'd watched one of their own get destroyed and then suddenly realized she'd been a warrior the whole time. In the boardroom on the 4th floor, the combat boots were now displayed in a glass case with a brass plaque, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." Beneath it, a photograph, 8-year-old boy in Helmand Province, held in the arms of a Navy corpsman, both of them covered in dust and blood and the terrible grace of people who decided to survive anyway. Faces turned toward the camera like they were asking if someone, someday, would understand what this moment cost. Elena stood in front of the case for a long time, her hand pressed against the glass. She didn't cry. The trembling wasn't fear anymore. The trembling was release, 20 years of it, finally allowed to move through her hands and into the world. If you've ever hidden who you are to survive, if you've ever known something that nobody else could understand, if you've ever wondered whether the quiet person in the room might be carrying a secret that changes everything, this story is for you. Subscribe to Code Whisperers to see the stories of the warriors walking among us, the ones who've decided to transform their pain into purpose. Like this video, comment with your own story of hidden strength, and tell me, what would you do if the person you were supposed to hate turned out to be the person who saved your life?